How we doing? Donna, how are you?
I don't know if I allowed myself enough time.
Am I allowed to sit here?
What's that? Yeah.
Okay. Do you talk loud?
What's that?
And I can stand if you want me to.
You can sit there, that's fine, but
I guess the question is about advancing the screen. You gonna do that?
I can,
Okay,
unless you want to do it yourself.
I'll give you the high sign. How about that? I don't want you to just sit there and do nothing through all this. Oh, well, that's, well,
But
it'd be, there you go.
But I only have like 7 slides. so
Oh, well,
mine's
see,
not-
there you go. All right. I'll try to have them, I should be done before 10 o'clock, so.
So I get from 10 to 10:15?
Pretty much, I think.
Uh-oh, Judy, you already advanced it.
I didn't even touch it.
I knew I shouldn't have said that out loud.
I did not even touch it.
Yeah, thanks, get out of here. Yeah,
I hate these things. I need an actual mouse.
that's why you're doing it, not me.
I need an actual mouse. Okay, where'd you go?
There he is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You may end up
I
Is
think
that
we
where
do
we
this
were?
every 2 years with the council because, yeah, yep. And,
Now don't.
and it's good to, because it's such a hard, it's really hard for people to understand the logistics of it. Which you really need to understand the logistics, otherwise you don't understand where the money's coming from. Yeah. Right, they do. Biggest misunderstanding out there.
Terry, how you doing? Great.
I know, this is just a council picture, right? Sure. No, I've already talked to them. I'm gonna do my separate. Okay, so you're not gonna get anything? Okay. None. Frame or no frame?
That's okay, picture with frame.
My wife is a frame board.
Yeah. Oh, I understand.
So my next question is, they want to do another work session. So I'm looking at March 24th. It's a Wednesday. Is that possible?
I'm in.
March 24th is the fourth Wednesday.
Fourth Wednesday.
31st is the fifth Wednesday. Fourth Wednesday works for me.
Community redevelopment law, so that's the whole entire law, and then there's some updates in there that's getting.
Yep.
So that's the whole law.
Question mark for March 24th?
Hey.
TIF, annexation, and finance.
Okay, everybody, it is 5 o'clock plus a little bit here. I don't see Les, so I'm assuming we are on TV tonight and online, so be advised. Conduct yourselves accordingly. We're having a Mayor and City Council work session tonight here on February 18th, beginning at 5 p.m. here in the City Council chambers. Current copy of the Open Meetings Act of Nebraska is posted on the wall at the back of the council chambers. No formal vote or action will be taken at this meeting. This is an informational event only. To that end, we will have a less formal meeting. So typically during a council meeting, we request the councilman and anyone address me and those folks before they begin to speak. Today would be just be kind of a normal discussion here. Mr. Jacobson and Judy will be presenting to us today throughout the evening, as well as some other folks that may or may want to make a comment or something. So we will be a little less formal. Anyone from the audience, though, please raise your hand before you just come up and speak. We do want to make sure, since we could have people watching, that we are using the microphone that's sitting there in front of Mr. Jacobson. So when he is done, we will slide it back over to the podium. And as long as the light's on, Mike, and it looks like it is, you are online.
I'm live.
Okay. We do need to have a call to order, so we are now in order, and we need to have a roll call. So roll call, please.
Nestle,
Here.
Tryon. Here. Bowles,
Here.
Lucas,
Here.
Garrett,
Here.
Harmon, Reeker, Woods.
Here.
Okay. Angie, do you know, are we expecting Mr. Carmen, or? Okay, I know Mr. Reeker will not be with us tonight, so. Okay. Well, we're going to have an exciting presentation starting off here on tax increment financing by Mr. Mike Jacobson. As I said in my very first addressing of this illustrious group, I want to make sure that we're always providing the very best information that we can in order to base all of our decisions on, because that is a responsibility for those that we represent, or excuse me, for us to make decisions based on the best information for those we represent. So tonight we'll be talking again about tax increment financing as well as missing middle housing. We'll have another work session to be scheduled next month. We will talk mostly about micro-TIF, finance, and annexation at that next meeting, most likely. Still up in the air, we're gonna have get the right people here. Mr. Jacobson, it's all you.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I appreciate the opportunity to come and present to you. I've been able to do this every year, I think, when there's a new council, and I can tell you that TIF can be very complicated, and I always find it a great opportunity for people to maybe hear it from me and ask any questions. Some of the other CRA members are here in the audience, and it's always good that everybody has a full understanding of really what's truth and what are you reading in the paper or hearing somewhere on the street that may or may not be accurate. So here's your opportunity to hear it firsthand and get any of your questions answered. Well, let's just start off, and I'm giving you copies of all that, and I'm gonna fast forward through some of it and try to really focus my time really on the mechanics of how this works. The first page following the cover page is what is tax increment financing, and again, this is created from a law that was passed, Nebraska Constitutional Amendment in 1980, and the subsequent enabling legislation. Basically, it allows local governments to use increased, and I stress increased, tax revenues, and the part that's missing is increased property tax revenues produced by a redevelopment project to partially finance the cost of some of the improvements associated with the project. That's really what it is. The next question then would become what projects qualify for TIF. In order to be considered for assistance, a project must meet each of the following 5 criteria. Number 1, the project must be located within an area designated blighted and substandard. Now, I would tell you the CRA has nothing to do with the designation of a blight and substandard area. That is totally the council's responsibility. Let me also be clear that the CRA has no authority to do anything other than carry out the wishes of the council, which is why the membership is appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the council. We have one member that goes off, that's up for reappointment or goes off every year on our 5-member group. We operate in an advisory capacity to the council. Our role is to review, and technically we're supposed to help solicit TIF projects, but our primary obligation has been to review projects, determine whether they qualify, and try to determine whether it meets all the criteria, which includes whether or not this project would move forward without TIF, okay? Then we make recommendations to the council. The council ultimately has the sole authority to approve a TIF project. And then the CRA then follows up by putting the contracts together and administering it after the council's approved it. So we have no ability to approve a project without the council, and we're appointed by the council or by the mayor and approved by the council. So when it comes to blight and substandard, these are two terms that are grossly misunderstood. I think most of us say what's blight, what's substandard. Okay, we all think we know what that means, but we don't. What this means is what the definitions say they mean. And so I'm not going to go through those in detail. There's a couple of slides ahead that will give you what that definition is. But I would tell you that it's not necessarily what you might think it has to do with, all right? The second thing that's required under a TIF project is it must not result in the loss of any pre-existing tax revenues. And in this case, again, when we say tax revenues, we're referring to property tax revenues to the city and other taxing jurisdictions. So when you hear people talk about we're taking taxes off the tax rolls, that's a false statement. You can't take off the tax rolls what isn't already there. And if it's there today, it's staying. We can't remove it. It won't be removed, period. Number 3, the project must have a preset cost-benefit analysis completed as part of the application. We do have that. Mike Bacon had developed that. We worked with University of Nebraska to develop our project, our cost-benefit analysis initially. It takes into consideration a number of factors. One of the factors it takes into consideration is, as an example, if you were in Lincoln or Omaha, okay? If you brought in a big new project that was going to bring in a lot of new families and they were going to bring a lot of children with them in school, then is that going to create a burden on the public school system to cause them to have to build new schools as a result of that influx of students? Okay, is that going to create other problems in city infrastructure because of all these new families moving to the area? Okay, when you look at it from our perspective, okay, if only we could get more students here in our public school system, okay? And why is that important to get more in the public school system? Well, that's because of the state aid that comes to the students. The more students you have in the public school system, the more state aid you get out of the TIOSA formula. And we get a bigger allocation of those dollars instead of it going to other school districts across the state if we have more students in our school system. So it is a significant revenue generator for the public schools. The public schools don't get too concerned about delaying the timing in which those tax revenues get on the tax rolls from the increase, because they know that's going to come down the road, and meanwhile they're getting those students and the additional revenue from those students. So it's hard for us to come up with a cost-benefit analysis that shows a negative for new development, because in most every case it's going to show it's a net positive because we've got excess capacity in most every area, except perhaps there might be some situations with sewer, perhaps some other issues that we'd have to look at. But we do look at it, but I can tell you there's generally a major benefit from developing and bringing new jobs and new families to the area. And then the other thing is the project must meet the application 18 points outlined in the public policy statement. I don't have that with me, but I can provide you with a copy of that. It's just a public policy statement that the CRA developed and was approved by the City Council, and it's been modified a couple of times along the way. In addition, the project must meet the following criteria. The developer must be able to demonstrate that the project would not be economically feasible without TIF assistance, and that the project would not occur in the area without assistance from the CRA. Let me be clear on what that's telling you. It doesn't mean that if Warren Buffett decided to come in here and build something that we would turn it down because Warren Buffett can afford to build it on his own. Warren Buffett's not going to build it if it's not economically feasible. Okay? So that's why we find as we get major companies that come in, like them or hate them, incentives are a part of our society. They're a part of how the economies work. In other states, in other cities, everybody's in the incentive game. And this is one of the tools that we have. And I would argue probably one of the best tools that we have available for incentive, because this incentive program is self-funded. And I'm going to show you as I go through this process further how it is self-funded by the developer. When you look at the state incentives, for example, the Advantage Act and other things, those are not self-funded. Those are funded by tax dollars, okay? And those are different. I'm not saying we should be opposed to those. I'm just saying I love TIF because it's self-funded, and it's an incentive program that can help keep us on the map and help encourage development that otherwise wouldn't occur here. I can also tell you that being the chairman of the CRA, you don't see a lot of these proposals that we get. I get contacted on an ongoing basis from people that want to know about TIF. Most of them leave with me telling them, don't waste your time, and they build their project, okay? We're not going to forward, the CRA is not going to forward a project to the city council that we haven't vetted and believe truly that this is going to happen, that this won't happen without TIF. Now, I'm going to tell you, we don't have a crystal ball, and people have been known to lie. But I would also tell you that we do, I think, a very good job of trying to figure out who would qualify, who wouldn't. I can also tell you I'm in conversations with Matt along the way on, you know, what we're looking at. So we're also conversing about, does this make sense and why does it make sense? So we're not going to bring you something that we don't genuinely believe needs to be approved. But at the same time, it's your decision to make. We're just an advisor. We're just trying to cut them back so that there's fewer of them coming directly to you, and you got less to look at, and so we're basically being the welcoming committee, if you will. All right? Okay, next page is really what constitutes a blighted area. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because, frankly, the blighted area and the substandard areas, which is the next two, are the next 3 pages here. These all lay out the definition of what you have to do to meet the blight and substandard category. This is what the company that does the blight sub-study will determine. And they're going to use these rules to do the blight study, and then they're going to come to the city council, and they're going to present it to the city council. The CRA plays no role in that, okay? We can encourage you to have a blight study done somewhere else. Someone can go out and engage a blight study to be done without the council, but it ultimately has to come to the council. So if the project goes out and has a blight study done by a certified, someone who's certified to do blight and substandard studies, and they present it to you and you guys look it over and say, no, we're not interested in doing that, then it stops. Otherwise, you personally, the council itself can engage someone to do a blight study on something you want to promote, but ultimately it's got to be approved by you. They're certified to do the blight and substandard studies, but you have to ultimately make the decision whether you're going to accept it and allow that to go forward. Brad?
So are they required to have all of these or a certain percentage, or how does that work?
No, basically these are the areas, so it needs to be, I think, as it relates to blighted, you need to have a few of these, okay? And then you have to have at least one of those on the second page to qualify. Now, let me give you a couple of examples if you look on that first page. Diversity of ownership, okay? You might have an area of town where you've got and let me pick a block. I can think of one in particular up in the original town, right along Highway 30, where you have deterioration, dilapidation in that entire block, just off the south side of Highway 30. And there are probably 10 different, or, 8 different structures there with 8 different owners. Okay? So that's a case where you might look at that and say, if we're gonna develop this, you're really gonna have to scrape the block and start over. And so you probably wanna get it under one owner. And so somebody may wanna get it blighted so they can go in and buy the entire block and do a TIF project up there. The beauty of something like that is that, and I'll get into what qualifies for expenses, but there's a case where the infrastructure is already there. In fact, the particular block I'm thinking of, there's street, sewer, water all the way around. No public infrastructure needed. It's just that it's crap throughout that block. Okay, so so then they would have what would qualify as their cost to purchase the property and tear the property down. Then they'd have to go to a housing, the housing TIF in order to get some of the vertical costs covered. But that would be a classic example to do a TIF project. Now, it hasn't been done up to now for 2 reasons. Number one, early on with the CRA, we reached out to the Original Town Association and said, are there areas of the original town you'd like to get blighted? If so, we will encourage the city council to do a blight study and blight it. And the answer was no, we don't want it done. So right now, there's about an 8-block area north of the tracks on either side of Dewey or on either side of Jeffers, and that's it. And there's another spot, I guess, over by the club, by the old country club. It's always going to be the country club in Meetai, sorry, but so those are the only 2 areas. Okay, the rest of the original town, none of it's been declared blighted and substandard. Now, I'd also say that we're limited to 35% of the land mass that can be blighted. So the CRA's also adopted the process that we would encourage the city council to refrain from just blanket blighting areas that aren't scheduled for development. If there isn't a developer that's expressed interest in going in and developing it, let's don't burn up our 35%. Let's only go into areas where we know that there is a development project planned and then blight it. I would also tell you that, and I've had this conversation with Mike Bacon, I would wish that at some point in time when the legislature's doing their cleanup, that they would codify into statutes officially what it takes to de-blight an area, because right now we're just using some examples of some areas in Omaha that went through a certain process and it's kind of been inferred that they de-blighted it. For example, you get into an area, the whole thing redevelops. Why is it still blighted? Why is it still in our blighted area if we've already redeveloped the whole area and there's going to be no more projects there? Let's move on and go somewhere else. So the other thing I would tell you is that on this first page, faulty lot layout and in relationship to size, adequacy, accessibility, usefulness. Okay, let's go back and look at the Dixie project. Okay, there was a plot of land that's been inside the city limits for a long time, well over 40 years, with no interior streets. So what's it going to take to develop that? Well, I can tell you that if you're going to build homes, you're going to have to go in, unless you're just going to build a cul-de-sac right off of a street and stop there. If you're going to go in and build out interior streets, run sewer, run water, run sidewalks, or whatever you need to do, you've got major costs up front. And you're not going to get your money until the back end of that project. Okay, so it's an impediment for a developer to go in there and develop lots. Donna?
I'm sorry, can we ask questions? and
Sure.
Interrupt you?
You bet.
Okay.
I'm used to that. I'm
Oh,
married.
are you? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused by the term development versus redevelopment, because that example you just gave would tell me that it was never developed. So I thought TIF was more for in need, blighted, substandard, and in need of redevelopment.
Well, the term redevelopment's not in the statutes. Okay, so we're
Sorry, it's
referred to
not.
as a well, Yeah, I mean, the statutes are really all about development and redevelopment are used synonymously.
I know they
This-
are, and it's
but-
kind of confusing.
But the
because to
statutes
me-
really don't really have redevelopment in the statute itself, okay? We're the redevelopment authority, but it's probably misnamed. It's a little bit like, the many things out there, but it's not, that's not the statutory issue here. Really, it's built around development. Just like urban renewal is not in the statute. But there are people that refer to it, it was supposed to be used for urban renewal. Well, show me in the statutes where it says urban renewal. It doesn't. So, that would be my answer.
Okay, it's just kind of confusing.
Oh, it is, yeah. It's just
I
as,
always
as
think
is
of
blight
TIF
and
as
substandard.
redevelopment.
Yeah. So, those are some issues. Also, improper subdivision, obsolete platting. All of those things are impediments to development. Okay, and I'll also tell you a good example would be if you go out and look at the project that was done, I always forget the project names, but if you go out to Walker Road and look at what Hanneborg's did, their project there. Okay, we had an issue there where there was not a street running through the east side of where this hotel's to be built. Well, the street wasn't there, it needed to be raised, we also needed drainage. Every time we got a heavy rain, water would back up onto Bill Summers' lots, and that whole area would flood out. So, when they came in, when Hanneborg's came in and said, look, we're willing to go ahead and develop this with a hotel, but we're gonna need TIF to be able to put the street in, get the proper sewer, storm sewer in place, along with the sanitary sewer, and so on, to make this work. Okay? So they went ahead and got approved for TIF. Now, I would tell you, you probably, and I'll get into this later, there's been nothing built there yet. But that's all their money that went into this. And if something doesn't get built within the time frame, then they're gonna end up just donating that street. But the taxpayer's not out a nickel on this deal. It's all their dime.
What is the time frame?
Oh, I'd have to go back and look, but we did phase that project, so he had, I think they're probably at the point now to where if they built something now, they wouldn't get the full 15 years on the first lot. And the second lot was gonna start, I think, 3 or 4 years in, and then they had to get something on the second lot. So they're way behind the 8 ball at this point, yeah. Okay, so again, then let's move on then to how the process works. First of all, the developer completes and submits a one-page application and the cost-benefit analysis worksheet, and submits a $5,000 non-refundable application fee to the development director. Why is there a $5,000 non-refundable application fee? Because at that point in time, the city officials are gonna have to start spending some time on it. If we just said, just submit an application and we'll run it through the process, you guys would really hate me more than you might right now, okay? So I'm just telling you, we'd be here with a whole bunch of applications potentially. So this is kind of meant to, you better be serious about your project, and you better be prepared to put the money up non-refundable. And it's kind of amazing how it keeps the spectators away, and it only keeps the serious ones still in the saddle. The CRA holds then a special meeting to consider preliminary approval of the redevelopment contract. If the preliminary approval is granted, the CRA then delivers to the city clerk a notice to the city council of the CRA's intent to enter into a redevelopment contract. The CRA also refers this to the Planning Commission, a copy of their redevelopment contract for their recommendation. The Planning Commission's role in this is to review it at a public meeting and determine whether or not this redevelopment plan meets with the current zoning and meets with a comprehensive plan. Theirs is a yes or no answer, okay? It either does or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, then what has to be done with zoning in order to make it fit? And then the city council will be aware of that, so that if they're going to approve it, they're likely gonna approve it with only after these zoning changes have been done, and so that everything's in compliance with the comprehensive plan. The planning then holds their public hearing, reviews the plan to confirm it, that it conforms to all that. Then there's a written recommendations with respect to the proposed plan within 30 days of receipt of the plan to the CRA. The CRA then recommends the plan to the city council for approval. Then the public notice of the city council public hearing follows the CRA meeting for all public hearing Notice must be published in a local newspaper and in the community at least 1 week for 2 consecutive weeks. Little typo there. The time for the hearing must be held not fewer than 10 days following the date of the last notice. Notice must also be given to neighborhood associations and have registered under the Section 5 that have registered under Section 5 of this section. Public notice that is clipped from the newspaper and sent by certified mail to each of the taxing authorities along with a map for the redevelopment site at least 10 days prior to the city council hearing. The second notice of city council public hearing is published in the North Platte Telegraph 1 week before, after the first publication. The Planning Commission meets to review the redevelopment plan and passes a resolution confirming its compliance with the comprehensive plan and current zoning. This resolution is then sent to the CRA. CRA then holds a special meeting to review the Planning Commission's resolution and makes recommendations to the City Council. City Council then holds a public hearing to receive public input on the proposed project and approves or rejects the redevelopment contract and plan. Then upon approval by the City Council, the CRA holds a special meeting to give final approval for the redevelopment contract and issues the TIF bonds. The developer purchases the TIF bonds to provide the funding. Generally, the developer borrows these funds from their development lender and pledges the bonds for security of the repayment of the loan. The CRA distributes all the proceeds from the bonds to the developer in accordance with the redevelopment contract, and the developer begins paying property taxes on the new tax base once the assessor assesses the property, which would begin, and this is where I kind of want to work through the math. If you get a project that gets approved this year, we're going to have a revaluation of the property as of January 1, 22. Okay? And then in September-October timeframe, all the taxing authorities are going to meet to set their budgets. Once they've set their budgets, that information then goes to the county treasurer, who then determines what the mill levy has to be in order to fund all of the budgets based on the valuations that were gathered as of January 1 that year. Okay, then tax notices get sent to everyone generally in December of that year. Your taxes, your property taxes, which is always news to some people, are technically due on December 31st, okay? So if there was a project done this year, we'd be using January 1's valuation, and then we would be doing this as of the 31st, but we're going to be doing it as of the next year because their project won't be done until the next year. So then your taxes are due December 31st, but you can pay the first half isn't delinquent until March 1st or May 1st of the next year, and the second half isn't delinquent until September 1 of the next year. So there's a gap year there before any tax collections start coming in from the completion of that project. So I'll walk through some of that as we get further up here. So now I want to walk you through the math of how this would work. If there's a piece of property the developer has and its current tax value, okay, I'm talking assessed value, is $150,000. And we're projecting that the final tax value is $1,250,000. Then the incremental tax value is the net difference, right? Because we're talking about increment. And the increment's the only thing you can capture because that $150,000 is a pre-existing base that can't be captured. The taxes off that cannot be captured. So the increment is $1,000,001. If you look at a mill levy of 0.0212 and some change, that would calculate that the current annual real estate taxes, and I'm talking now the $150,000, that would be generating $3,187 a year in property taxes. That $3,187 continues to get paid to the taxing authorities regardless of what decisions get made on TIF. That is locked in, that's baked in the cake. Taxing authorities get their split of that. If you look at what the increment would be, or excuse me, what the projected new tax bill would be, gross, okay, on the $1,250,000, it's gonna produce $26,561 in property taxes. The increment then, of course, is the 26,561 less the 3187. So the 23,374 is the amount that's gonna get diverted to pay the bond for the TIF bond. How do we determine then the size of the TIF bond? It's simply a net present value calculation, okay? We typically assign an interest rate to the TIF bonds. We don't have to. The one bond that Chief was involved with, we used a zero interest rate. I'm here to tell you that in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter, but it kinda does. And I'm gonna explain why. If we use typically we were using roughly a 6%, we're now looking at really kind of what's a 10-year treasury, but we're probably not gonna go all the way down to a 10-year treasury rate today. But if you take the net present value, we come up with $177,097. What does that number represent? What that number represents is if you have an income stream of $23,374, and you're gonna get that over 14 years because you lose the first year, and you're paying, in this case, probably 6% interest, that's how much you could borrow to fully amortize it over that 15-year time frame and the 14 installments you're gonna get. Does that make sense? Now, why does the interest rate not matter, but kind of matter? Okay? The reason the interest rate doesn't matter is you're getting $23,374, and the developer's funding the bond. And the developer's gonna get the $23,374. So do I care whether he gets interest on that and the bond's smaller? Or, because what's gonna happen to the size of the bond if the interest rate is lower? If you're getting $23,374 a year, and the interest rate is 6%, we can size the bond at $177,000. What if we set the interest rate at 3%? Would the $177,097 be larger or smaller? Exactly. It'd be larger. Why would it be larger? Because you're not taking interest out. So if you go to zero, okay, here's the trick question. If you go to zero interest and you get 14 payments of $23,374, how big's the bond? It's $23,374 times 14, right? So it doesn't matter what the interest rate is because it's all going to the developer anyhow. But it kind of matters because the size of the bond is going to limit how many qualified expenses you can pay. So if I'm a developer and I'm going to have plenty of qualified expenses, then they're going to say, in fact, if you got to the point where your qualified expenses exceeded the 177, what are you going to lobby for? You're going to lobby us to lower the interest rate, aren't you? Because you want the bond larger. So our general approach to that is, nah, I don't think so. We're going to probably downsize it some, okay? So you know, that's kind of the gymnastics that we would go through when it comes to setting the interest rate, and that's why. The next page, I'm kind of a visual kind of guy, okay? So the next page I want you to look at, and again, let's show what we're talking about here. What does the base number mean? Okay, let's go back again. If you go back to that earlier page where I ran the page before. Okay, let's start with current tax valuations, $150,000, and so the $150,000 would be what? It would be that line there, where the line at the top of the yellow, bottom of the orange line, right? That's what 3,187 is. That 3,187 continues to go to the taxing authorities for 15 years. And at the end of 15 years, what happens? And I say the earlier, it's actually the earlier of 15 years or when the bond gets repaid. The earlier of. And as soon as the bond gets repaid or the 15 years run, the entire tax base goes to the taxing authorities. That's what that chart's showing you. And what the orange line up top is showing you is that along the way, we're also getting some increase in value of the redevelopment project. So some of you, I know you're getting ahead of me, you're saying, well, Mike, what about that base? I mean, isn't it going up every year? Well, I don't know, is it?
No.
You got raw land out there, how much is it gonna go up every year? Versus somebody building significant development on it, okay? So that's why that continues to be a flat line, and that's all that would go. And so that's graphically how this works. Questions? Matt?
In your experience in the past TIF projects that the city has had, has the tax increment period been the full 15 years, or have some of them been shorter?
Most all of them have been shorter, okay? And I would just tell you that, you know, we're kind of a cunning group, really, when you think about it, okay? Here's what our calculations are. Again, keep in mind that orange line. There are two assumptions that the CRA makes when we size these bonds. Actually, three if you look at the interest rate, but there's two assumptions we look at. We want to go to the tax, to the appraiser for the county to have them give us an indication of what that tax value is going to be. And let me also clarify that the tax value and the cost in the project are two different numbers. In most cases, you build something new, your tax valuation is going to be about 80% of that cost in the project. Okay, and I've got a little more I'll tell you about that later, but let's just think about that for now. But once you build once they tell us what that tax value is going to be, then we're going to calculate using the mill levy, or we're going to use the current mill levy, and we're going to use that tax valuation, and we're going to assume that that value never goes up over the 15 years. Is that a good assumption? Not for the developer, it's not. Because they're going to say, well, wait a minute, that value is going to go up. Well, maybe, maybe not. But we're using the current value, okay? So that in itself will generally cause these projects to pay out early, all right? Let me give you a little story about Menards, okay? When Menards built their project, okay, they bought 80 acres of farmland, plus or minus. They put in all the interior streets. They put in the acceleration and deceleration lanes, and they paid for all the public infrastructure, sewer, water, to connect our sewer and water system so that our tower that's underground, which is kind of an oxymoron, south of town, is connected, okay? They spent far more in public infrastructure, irrespective of the purchase of the land. Public infrastructure costs fully utilized the tax dollars they got, or the TIF dollars that they got, okay? The other thing we did is we went to the county assessor and said, what's the assessed value going to be? They gave us a number. We went to Menards and said, okay, here's what the number's going to be. Well, they screamed like stuck pigs. Well, we can build it for a hell of a lot less than that, and we don't need, that's way too high. Oh my God, we've got others, and look, this is what it's going to be assessed at. And oh, by the way, part of the deal when you sign up for a TIF project is you're agreeing to not protest your taxes anytime during the time the bond's outstanding, okay? If you protest your taxes, the bond is due. Pay us off, okay? So they tend to not protest taxes at that point. So, of course, they're coming to me, the bad guy. Mike, the number's too high. I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but that's the number. Well, we don't want to go with that number. I said, well, I'm not the tax assessor. You're going to talk to them. But you need to decide whether you want the TIF or not. If you don't want the TIF, then don't worry about it. Go protest it. Otherwise, if you want TIF, this is what's going to be. So I think Menards, I know I got to go back and look at it. They were about 8 years in before that bond paid out. Why? Well, we started fairly high on their tax assessed value, and it continued to go up. And so what ended up happening is they generated enough additional revenue above what we projected that it paid off early. What did they do? As soon as they could after tip bond got paid off, they protested their taxes. But they built a very similar project in Kearney at the same time. Ours is still valued for tax purposes higher than the Kearney project is. I'm also going to tell you, Kearney did not use TIF. But what did Kearney do? What Kearney did, if you recall where Menards is located in Kearney, it's north of the mall, about, I guess, a quarter of a mile down, or a half mile down the road, okay? Because they built on the north end of that quarter section. And what did they need? They needed a street to run through that development. So the developer that owned the land made the deal with the city that the city would go in with a connection district, pay for all of that street improvement, sewer and water, and get repaid from a connection district. In that case, tax dollars were used by the city to do all that. In North Platte, not $1 of tax dollars went into the development with Menards, and all the dollars that they used for TIF was the acceleration, deceleration lanes, and public infrastructure. And our valuation is still higher than Kearney's. So I'm saying we're winning, all right, just for whatever that's worth.
Is Menard still considered blighted then?
They are, and see, technically, when we TIF Menards, we were hopeful that they would sell more of their lots. And because we captured all of the increment in that entire area. So if they would have built, if someone else would have come in and built a project, they couldn't have used TIF until the bond was paid off. Because all the proceeds from any development in that entire 80 acres went to pay off the Menards bond. Now, if Menards would sell a lot to somebody who was going to build out there, they would be eligible for TIF because it's still blighted at this point. But at this point, there's very little public infrastructure that would be needed. So I'm going to get here in a minute as to what the qualified expenses are, which would tell you that they wouldn't qualify for much because of what expenses have to go in. Only the land acquisition would qualify for TIF.
So is there a process to unblight that then? Or?
Well, the council could choose to de-blight the area, yes. And if we de-blighted the area and went through, and again, Mike Bacon and I have this conversation every now and then. When I think he doesn't have anything to do, I raise the question again and say, what are we going to do about this? I still don't feel comfortable that we ought to. I guess I'm a banker. I kind of feel like I'd like to see it in black and white. But there is there is a process in place that we believe would be sufficient to de-blight an area. And if you de-blight it, then it would no longer be eligible for TIF if another project went in. Yes.
Well, we have that 35% cap. That's
And that cap would give us more room on the cap.
exactly.
Donna.
So in your example for North Platte, no tax money was paid for this public infrastructure? Is that
Correct.
what you're saying? But for 15 years, the city has to maintain that, right?
No, I mean, it's a state highway, so the state pays for any maintenance of the highway itself, and the interior streets are all theirs.
Okay,
So it's their development.
okay.
They had to build them to city specs though, so those,
So maybe not your example, but if there was a TIP project in another part of town where this same scenario happened, where the city would have to keep the streets up.
well, I
snow
guess,
removal, so it would, in a sense.
well, if you put in a
cost.
concrete street, it's gonna last more than 15 years.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah,
Put
so-
some in. Can we blight a bunch of streets in town?
Yeah, well, I don't think they do it for
Donna,
potholes, no.
Donna, there's an example of a situation maybe that you're talking about is the Hannahboard project that he referred to earlier. The city owned the land adjacent to that with the park there, correct? And so the city participated, we passed, as a city council, passed road districts for the portion that tied to the city. So that was a little bit of a co-op in what you're referring to, because there was partial streets installed by the city and partial streets installed by the developer based on who owned the property, correct? So that's a little different example because of how
So
it
a road
connects.
district, is that what you called it? So what does that mean?
Right. Well, in other words, the city chose to do a new road in that.
And keep it up, maintain it?
Well,
I'm just-
it's a city street, so it would be maintained just like any of our other city streets, I believe.
Okay, I just want to understand that there could be in some developments cost to the city for that 15 years.
Well, if it's inside the city limits, you're gonna build the city specs, so you're using concrete. If you're going out in the country and you're using asphalt, then, but the city's not accepting those streets, and at least not initially.
Correct. Typically, concrete street, I'm gonna say, has a 30-year lifespan, where an asphalt street would be in the 20-year lifespan, well in excess of the 15 years that is involved in the TIF.
Sure, but there would be snow removal, I mean, there could be others
Yeah.
tied to it, okay.
But we made that decision, so in other words, that was a council decision in conjunction with the whole project.
We're getting sales tax revenues, we're getting other tax
Right,
revenues as a result.
There were
of
other
that.
positive reasons to do it, right?
Right.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's move to the next page. I always like this math page, and I would just tell you, I don't know, Rob, you guys, how many times did I go through this chart to get the CRA to understand this? And I always have to remind myself of this at times. Okay. I'm gonna follow the math, and again, I'm a visual kind of guy. So let's start with how this works on the flow of funds. Once the TIF project's been approved, and remember I went back and said the bond size was $177,097, correct? All right, the first thing that happens is magically, bang, next slide. Developer, give me another slide. Give me a vowel. Okay, the developer's lender, generally speaking, although the developer could be self-funding this, is gonna loan the developer the value of the bond. And then the developer is gonna fund it. Next slide. And they're gonna write a check to the CRA. How much money does the developer have in his pocket right now? Well, it's assuming that there's no float on the check and the check is cleared, okay? All right, got zero. Okay, next slide. The CRA then creates a TIF bond, and then they fund the bond. And, yeah, there you go. And they give the bond to the lender for collateral, because then when the payments get paid on the bond, they're gonna flow to the developer's lender to get repaid on his loan. Next slide. Then the CRA gives the developer a check for $177,097. So, let's review. Developer is out $177,000 in a loan to the the developer's lender is out $177,000, but they got a note on their books. The developer then gives that money to the CRA, so the developer's got $0 loan obligation to the lender. The CRA then gives the developer's lender the bond to hold, and the flow of funds is gonna go to the lender. And then the CRA is gonna give the developer the money. All right, at the end of the day, the developer's lender has a note that's secured with a bond that's gonna be repaid over the next 15 years with interest. If we include interest, which is generally why we do. The developer now has ended up with what? How much does the developer have in their pocket? At this point, they've got $177,097, don't they? How much is the CRA out? Zero, right? So who funded the bond? The developer, right? The developer funded the bond. We just facilitated it and issued the bond, but we're not out any cash. Taxpayer's not out any cash, the city's not out any cash. And oh, by the way, that bond, is there any liability back to the city on the bond? No. No. Here's the bond, good luck, collect from the developer. What happens if the bond is too large, oversized, the 15 years run, and there's still debt to be owed to the lender. Who pays that?
The developer,
The lender hopes that the developer does.
well, he's supposed to, yeah.
Otherwise, that's a grant, okay?
Yeah.
But the city's not out and the CRA's not out, okay? So if you're a smart lender, and I happen to think we've got a couple of them that are pretty smart, we're probably not gonna loan the developer the full face of that bond, okay? We're just that way, okay? We like to be secure. So we're gonna probably loan less than the full face amount of the bond, and the developer's still gonna have some real money in this deal. But at the end of the day, I want you to see, this is fully funded by the developer. Any questions on that at all?
I understand the whole process, but I do have a question on, so when, the bank, the lender is sitting here holding that bond, is there reports, are there reports that have to go back to the lender to make sure that the developer is spending it like he's supposed to? Is there accountability? of
Well,
this?
I would tell you that the CRA's not gonna issue the bond and fund it until the developer brings us in receipts that we can confirm that all of the dollars in the bond have been expended for qualified expenditures.
After the fact.
In other words, we're not gonna let you fund the bond. You're not gonna bring any money in from your developer or pay us and go through this. This process only begins after the developer has already expended enough money on the project to have spent at least $177,097 on qualified expenses, and I'm getting to what those are.
Okay, so have
Okay.
you ever had somebody, just a developer, go, whoa, church, wait a minute, I can't do this, and,
They won't have a bond. We're not gonna do the bond until they've already jumped, they're already drowning before we issue the bond, and then we don't care. Well, we care kind of, but, not really. I mean, it's their deal. Ty?
Mike, there's a question as a banker that I get asked periodically that I think is important for people to understand with it is, I'll have people say, well, why don't they sell the bond so they don't have to worry about all this loan nonsense and get their money? Or why doesn't the bank just own the bond and take the developer out of it? And the reason is that the bond is worth more to the developer than anybody else because they control its value. Because if they don't build that project, the money will never come. If they don't pay the taxes on time, the money won't come until the tax certificates come. And so that's what's so unique about this structure is that bond has more value to the person that owns the property than anybody else because they're ultimately in control of paying the payments on the bond.
And let me give an example to further underscore what Ty just said. Okay, let's assume that the developer builds a C-store, and it's not working very well. And lo and behold, a tornado comes through and wipes it away. Then the developer says, I wasn't making any money on this thing anyhow. I'll just take the insurance check. Okay? So what happens to the tax value of that lot that just had the tornado go through? It's gonna go way down, way down. Okay? So what's that gonna do to repayment of the bond? It's impaired, big time. So the developer's not gonna be able to pay that loan off. One reason why his lender would like to have a little skin in the game on this deal. Let me give you an example, Walmart. When the food distribution center was built, okay, the developer was the development corporation. They went out, bought the land, did the TIF bond, collected the TIF revenues off of that Walmart Stores East. Walmart Stores East is the owner of that property, not Walmart Stores. Who's Walmart Stores East? They're a holding company that owns that building, okay? So what if the distribution center was a failure? Say 2-3 years in, and they said, North Platte wasn't the right spot. We're gonna go back to Colorado where we were as our alternative site, and we're gonna build a new site there. So we've got 20 acres under roof out here. You think Walmart's gonna sell that to a competitor? No. But what are they gonna do with it? It's gonna sit there empty. And if it sits there empty, what's the tax assessor gonna do? I'm gonna assess it for what it can produce for revenue, and I gotta bring the tax assessed value down. And then all of a sudden, the money that Devco borrowed to be able to do this other infrastructure is not gonna get repaid. And the banks have loaned the money to develop it, to Devco, and it's not their first rodeo, and they decided that, you know, we'd kinda like Walmart stores to guarantee that bond, which they did, so we could safely move forward. So there's, as Ty, I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Anybody that says these TIF bonds are a gravy train doesn't understand the risk that's involved in holding a TIF bond. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. The mill levy could drop, you could have the valuation drop for any number of reasons, and that bond's not gonna pay in full. I wouldn't invest in that, okay? I don't wanna own it, as Ty said, the only person who's got a vested interest to own that TIF bond is the developer, because he's the one that's gonna control whether it gets repaid. So that's why you don't wanna own them. And I already told you the example on the interest rate. Hell, I don't care if you want 20% interest on the TIF bond, we'll write it for 20%. What's the value of the bond gonna be? It's gonna be minuscule. Okay? We got the same pool of revenue coming in, okay? You tell me how you want it allocated. You want to allocate it to interest or principal? But there's only a finite amount of money that's gonna be collected over that 15-year period of time. So it doesn't matter what the interest rate is, other than it will matter when I get to this next page. Are you ready for the next page? Because you were jumping ahead of me, Don. I just want to make sure that we're good here. All right. So, all right, so now we're in the repayment phase. Now the developer's paying their taxes. Again, if you go back on your cheat sheet to that previous page I had, what was the gross valuation of the property gonna be after that thing was built? It was gonna be $1,250,000. And so if the gross taxes that the developer's gonna pay to the city, or to the county treasurer, is $26,561. So they're gonna pay the full amount of the tax bill. Then the county treasurer's gonna split it off. And they're gonna split it so that $3,187 goes to the taxing authorities, just as it always did, because we're not removing any taxes from the tax rolls, are we? And the other $23,374 is gonna be sent to the CRA, and the CRA is then gonna send it to the bondholder, which is either the lender, the developer, or the developer, or if the developer sold it to whoever he sold it to. But all that's on record. It's pretty easy. We collect the money, we look at the owner of the bond that's on file, and that's who we send the check to. End of story. Make sense? So who's repaying the TIF bond? Developer, right? Isn't he the one paying the taxes on the property? Okay. Okay, let's move on to eligible expenses. All right, under regular TIF, this is not housing TIF, this is regular, traditional, good old-fashioned TIF.
Excuse me, I have one more question before
Sure,
you go.
go for it.
I'm sorry, back on.
That's
that
what I'm here for.
page. I know it. So what happens if the developer, I mean, the whole project is sold to somebody else before the developer pays back the bond?
Well, the taxes are a super priority lien on the property,
Okay.
okay?
Oh, so that bond would come due immediately then?
No, what would happen is, if the developer builds the project and the tax base is there, okay, then this is where the lender that loaned the money to the developer to build the project, they get a little nervous, because if you don't pay your property taxes, then they become a super priority lien ahead of the lender and God, okay? They're ahead of everybody, okay?
Even debt taxes, probably.
Yes. So, at the end of the day, it's a super priority lien, and so you are pretty secure at that point. And if they don't generate enough revenue, the holder of the bond is the one who takes the hit. So you can't really lose on our end. We've gotten some redevelopment occurred. If it fails, but it's not our money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
They can sell the bond separately, so if a developer develops a project and sells that project, like, say somebody built a hotel and used TIF and sold that hotel, they could then decide if they wanted to still hold that TIF bond, or if they
Oh, it
wanted
would
to,
go with-
or they could sell it with the property, they are sellable.
Oh,
So in
okay.
some cases, you might see them sell it to the next property owner, or in other cases, you might see them hold it, and then they'd hope the new hotel owner paid their taxes, of course, timely, so their bond paid. So they can detach those from the property in the future, but you don't see it very often, they tend to
Yeah.
kind of stay together.
And I think when I know there was some discussion at one time that there was a TIF recipient who was delinquent on their real estate taxes. Not my problem, okay? I don't care. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't really care, because if he doesn't pay his taxes, he's not getting paid on his TIF bond. And he's paying 14% interest for the delinquent taxes. So, and the county's gonna go sell the tax certificate and get their money. So who's out? You know, I mean, I don't, again, I don't mean to be callous, but I mean, who cares? I mean, it's not our issue. So, again, ready to go forward?
Yes,
All right.
thank you.
Stop me anytime.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so what are the eligible TIF expenses? Well, first one, and the biggest one generally is land acquisition, okay? If you're buying the land, then the land acquisition costs count as a qualified expense. So we'll go back to Menards. If Menards sold a developed lot out there and somebody wanted to try to TIF it because it's a blighted area, they could TIF the cost of the land acquisition. There would also be clearing the property, demolition of the site, but there wouldn't be any out there. Install streets, utilities, parks, public spaces, over and underpasses. None of those. Public parking, convention centers, lighting, shelters, and benches. So you could include the parking lot, a paved parking lot. Costs for planning and design and engineering, you could include that. And then rehabilitation of existing structures, there wouldn't be any. So you can see that the TIF number would be pretty small for somebody to go into a fully developed area, other than the land acquisition costs, to really get much of a size on that TIF bond. Then if you go to workforce housing benefits, okay, workforce housing was an add-on. And what workforce housing does is it expands the eligible expenses. It's the same process as regular TIF, but it expands the qualifying expenses to include construction costs to build workforce housing that exceeds the minimum building and design standards in the community. In other words, now you can include the vertical costs of building the structure. Okay, but to do that, you need to then have a plan for reducing the rental purchase cost to make the housing affordable. So the bottom line is what, if you're gonna accept TIF for rental housing, you have to show that you're gonna come in below market on the rental rates that you're gonna charge for those that are gonna lease the properties. And you've gotta be below market, and then we're gonna evaluate what the market is and make certain that and that's gonna be part of their plan when they come to the council, as what their plan is, and you can decide whether that's equitable to allow them to have additional qualified expenses. Now again, remember when we went back and talked about sizing the TIF bond? Okay, if I wanted to go out to the Menard, I wanted to buy one of the Menard properties, one of those lots, because it's still blighted, and said, I want to apply for TIF, and I'm not going to do this unless I get TIF. And the other thing I'm going to do is I want to include the cost of the site acquisition and development fees and the parking lot. That's not going to amount to a lot of money. What interest rate do you think they want on the TIF bond? They want zero. Okay, they were going to want zero. They want a big, actually, no, excuse me. They're not going to want zero. They're going to want a high interest rate. They're going to want a high interest rate because they're going to, well, depending on which direction I go, let me see. They want to be in a case where they can fully use the bond created, okay? So they're going to want more interest and a smaller bond, but more interest paid on the bond to game the system. We're not going to let them game the system. So that's what we look at in every one of those cases. That makes sense? Again, if the interest rate is lower, the bond is larger. So if you want the bond to be smaller to fit within what your qualified expenses are, yeah, I'd like a 20% interest rate, please. Right? Isn't that what you'd ask for?
Why wouldn't you just ask for a smaller bond?
Because I'm gonna get the interest in addition to my principal repaid with that tax revenue. That's why you're gonna wanna upside. That's why you want the bond's gonna be smaller. I mean, so what you're gonna do is you need to make sure you got eligible expenses to fully utilize the bond. So you're gonna have an incentive to make the bond fit your eligible expenses. And you could do that technically with interest rate. Moving it up or down, it's gonna change the size of the
So it's
bond.
kind of like the principal and interest. This is paying off the principal.
Principal and the interest both come out of the TIF bond, and that's how we size it. So we're gonna go look at what the tax assessed value is gonna be when you're done. And we're gonna come up with what revenue's coming in every year, and we're gonna present value that revenue at an interest rate. If the interest rate is 0, the bond is gonna be larger, because there's no interest coming out. If we price the bond at a high interest rate, the bond is gonna be smaller, because we gotta take interest payments out every year over that 15-year period of time. So if I have lower qualified expenses, my incentive is to make the bond smaller to fit my expenses, which means I want the interest rate higher, because then I'm gonna capture all the revenue for the full 15 years. That's the goal of the developer at that point.
Whereas if you had a maximum bond with a low interest rate, but not enough qualified expenses.
Right. Yeah, and if you have more qualifying expenses, and you want the bond to be bigger, then you ask for a lower interest rate and you make the bond size bigger because what they want to do is maximize the size of the bond. And they got to have qualifying expenses to justify the bond size. So the bond is maximum is this, or the total amount of your qualifying expenses, whichever is less. So you want to try to move this around. We don't let them play that game.
Match your expenses, though.
Yeah.
Is that, am I right there?
Yeah, well, it ultimately comes down to qualifying expenses. That under regular TIF, not housing TIF, under regular TIF, the reason workforce housing TIF came into play is because you didn't have enough qualifying expenses to offset enough of the cost to build that infrastructure. Land acquisition and site prep doesn't generate enough dollars, but vertical structure really increases the TIF expenses. So now, under that scenario, you want a really low interest rate. Mark?
Does the bond have to be 14 years times the increased tax value?
No, that's the
Okay.
maximum. It's
All right.
15-year maximum.
Well, then, it seems like it'd be better, maybe I'm looking at this wrong, but it seems like it'd be better for the city if they just borrowed what they needed to capture those qualifying costs at 0%, and they would have it paid off sooner, and then the city would get the tax dollars sooner. Am I wrong, or?
No, I think really what would make a difference here, Mark, and I thought where you were going with this is,
Yeah.
the TIF bond can run for a maximum of 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
It could run, you could say, I'm only gonna approve it for 10 years.
Oh, okay, so it is variable.
Now, the problem is that are you gonna have the developer say, screw it, I'm not gonna do it for that, you know?
Mhm.
So that's, but at the end of the day, when we look at qualifying people for TIF, part of the thing we look at is, are you gonna have enough qualified expenses to justify going through the expense of doing a TIF
Yeah.
bond? Okay, I mean, I've been criticized for, why does the CRA have kind of an artificial minimum of about $325,000 bond on a TIF bond? Why? By the time you pay for Mike Bacon's legal expense to develop all of the work and you pay your $5,000 fee,
Yeah. You've got some
what are
money
you getting at
invested.
the end of the day? Is there any money left over? You know, why go through all the headache and why have you guys go through it all? So again, I don't wanna be traipsing in here with $100,000 TIF bond and waste you guys' time and legal expense and have them not really get any benefit. So we just kind of backed into this and said 325 is probably the number. Now, I could go on into a rant here at this point and talk about,
That won't be necessary.
Well,
Yeah, well, I mean,
let me ask you another question instead then. Do Mr. Bacon's cost, I know the 5,000 doesn't go into the bond.
Developer-
They're just out to 5,000. And I understand why.
yeah, and the developer pays Bacon's cost directly.
Okay,
he
they
bills
don't go into the bond either.
No, he
Okay.
pays them directly.
Okay, thank
And,
you.
and I would also say that Bacon represents the CRA, so that if he works for the developer has to agree that Bacon represents the CRA, and if there's any problems down the road, he represents us, not you.
Okay,
Find your own attorney.
And maybe a point to clarify, the 325 is increment, not bond size, right?
Correct.
So what he's saying, you don't have to have a $325,000 minimum bond to make it work. You have to
Move
have
the
a-
increment
You
by
have to
that
move
amount.
the increment, so those, just to clarify
Good
that.
clarification, yeah, thanks, Ty. Yeah,
Okay.
you gotta move the increment by at least 325,000.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that's been problematic, and I always like to use this example, go downtown. All of you guys remember Hoover's Jewelers, okay? Remember when they did all that refacing and redid their jewelry store?
yeah,
All right, they spent about $500,000 refacing it, gutting it, redoing it inside. You know how much the tax increment moved? Probably less than $100,000. Why? Because the way the math works on revaluing property. You take the average age of the property. How old were those how old is that building that they have downtown? Old. Heck, it's older than, a lot older than me, a lot older than me. And older than you too, Donna. And so I'm just.
Careful there.
I said older than dirt.
Oh, okay, all right. So you have to average that. So we've had a hole here because it's hard to use TIF effectively when you're not gonna move the increment. Okay? Which is why haven't we done projects in the downtown area? Unless you're gonna scrape a building and build new, or like on the Pawnee, if they would have come in and said, we want to completely rebuild the whole property, yeah, you could move the increment. But you're not gonna move it nearly as much if you build brand new. Because you gotta average and is that a bad thing? Okay, from my perspective, remember that by getting this tax valuation break, if you will, because it's an old property, TIF is only gonna give you that money back for 15 years, and then guess what? You're paying full tilt, right?
Yeah.
So, isn't it a good thing if I don't have my value go up from that standpoint, from a tax value standpoint? So if I have an old property that's like new, or a brand new property, the old property that's been fixed up like new is gonna have a much lower tax base and tax valuation, and hence property tax bill, than the brand new property. But again, it's hard to incent those because you can't get the bond, you can't get the increment moved enough to generate enough TIF value. Which is why, and that's, if I were going into a rant, I would be telling you, we had a solution to that. We may come back to the city council with that solution again, which is our redevelopment fund, where we provided grants. We played a little Robin Hood. Instead of giving all of the proceeds to the developers on these TIF projects, we're required to give them all of the money, but we gave them 75% of that money as a grant, and we loaned them 25% of the property. And that's what happened in the case of Menards, and that's what happened in the case of Cabela's. Cabela's also screamed like a stuck pig. They're still mad at me, but they're sold now, so I don't care. And then they had to repay that money back to the CRA. When that money came back, it went into a redevelopment fund, and we used that then to target the downtown area. And that became, we couldn't do that anymore, okay? But there is a way that I think the city council could participate in where we could do it. The requirement now would be that any repayment of those funds would have to go directly into the city's general fund, which then the city could then redirect the CRA to use for those kinds of projects that you would approve. So it's still not gone, but maybe back at some point. So, but that's why we don't do a lot of small downtown projects, because the numbers don't work. Okay, key takeaways. The TIF benefit or the bond is limited to the amount of the tax increment created regardless of the project size. Bond is fully funded by the developer. Bond is repaid from incremental tax collected from the project. Projects are subject to the but-for test. No taxpayer funds ever at risk. Beginning tax base never leaves the tax rolls. Sales tax and personal property taxes from the project go to the taxing authorities as they normally would. We're only capturing real property taxes. Job creation includes both management positions and support roles. That's all new economic activity for the city and the county and all the taxing authorities. And I don't know that I meant to update this, but at the time I did this, there were 15 total projects approved over the last 20 years. So we've approved less than one per year. 13 of those projects at the time, of the 13 funded projects at the time, 9 of them have fully repaid. The incremental tax base is increased by $72 million. The tax base is increased by almost $1,592,000 per year. Sales tax and retail draw in North Platte were substantially increased as we continue to do TIF projects. Particularly, I could point to the distribution center, but I could also point to Hobby Lobby. When you looked at the pull factor for retail sales, when Ogallala built their Walmart Supercenter, we saw people quit coming from Ogallala to North Platte. We built Hobby Lobby, and they're back, okay? So having that opportunity is good. I would also tell you Menards, all you gotta do is drive by the Menards parking lot today and look at the Kansas cars with counties outside of Lincoln County. It's a big draw. And when people come here, they don't just go there to shop. They're probably gonna buy some gas. They maybe do other things here while they're here. So it's an economic driver. So in conclusion, the only argument against TIF.
Hey, Mike,
Yes.
Before you go there. Just real quick, Mike, for purposes of clarity, projects are subject to but-for test. Doesn't that tie back to slide number 4 where the developer is able to demonstrate that the project would not be economically feasible?
That's the but-for.
It's the if not but-for. The project would not happen if not but-for TIF, right?
Let me just
sir.
tell you that the first conversation I have with somebody when they come to me and ask about TIF is we have the conversation, what are you gonna do, how are you gonna do it, what's the one, why do you think you need it? All right, all these things. All right, look me in the eye and tell me this thing won't be built and cannot be built if I can't get TIF. And I've had one person look me in the eye and say, there's no way in hell I can do this without TIF. That's the only one I know of that lied to me, okay? So I'm just gonna tell you that I have a long memory, and you can only lie to me once, okay? So I'm gonna probably have a chip on my shoulder going forward, because my view is we're playing this straight up. I'm a taxpayer, a fairly large property taxpayer in Lincoln County and in North Platte. I'm not here to give tax base away, but I am here to broaden our tax base. And we broaden our tax base by getting more developments here. We broaden our tax base by getting more families here that are gonna buy homes and build homes and work here and put their kids into the public school system. That's how we build a strong economy. North Platte is 100 miles from anywhere. We're still a thriving regional trade center. All of you know, I chair the airport authority, and no, I'm not looking for new things to do, and I'm looking forward to leaving the airport authority at some point. But my goal going on the airport authority was to get a real airline in here, and now to work on getting this new manager in place, and now to work on getting our long-range plan started. And then I'm gonna go back and sit at my desk and do nothing and watch the rest of the staff do the work at the bank. But until that time, I wanna see a couple things through. So that's my spiel. I'm open to any questions that you might still have. And how do we do on time?
hour and 20. Last one
Good
rant.
work.
Was it more or less than you anticipated?
Slightly less. I lost the pool.
Could ask more questions.
I'm just kidding. There was not really a pool, just for the record, but as far as anyone knows.
Well, I can ask him more questions if you split it with
keep
me.
keep going. We kind of glossed you over your last slide there. You said the only argument against TIF, and I interrupted you. Did you
Okay,
have
yes,
something you
the
wanted to
only,
make there?
only argument against TIF, is would the project happen regardless, okay? And again, it's not a matter of can somebody afford to build it. It's a matter of will they build it, okay? If I can afford to go build something, I'm not gonna do it unless I can make some money with it. And if I can, I'm not gonna build it. And that's what every developer's looking at, okay? And they're also looking at where else can I go and do it that will work with me. So, and then you also have to understand the profit dynamics of the various projects, knowledge of the corporate site section criteria to help confirm the need for TIF. And I would tell you that one reason that your CRA is diverse, has the diversity that it does, I've chaired the CRA from the beginning. I've continued to volunteer to let somebody else take that job if they'd like it. I keep getting turned down on that. I think it's important enough that I'm gonna continue to hang in here and take the abuse because I think it's worth it. Rob Stefka is on the CRA. Rob, as you all know, is a commercial real estate broker, has a good handle on what the market is and what rents are and what people are doing. Don is a former businessman, downtown businessman. We also have Edie Patterson, who's on the council on the board. And Edie, of course, had Pro Printing and Graphics, is retired now. And then Tim Brulliette, an attorney, is also on it, because you have to have an attorney. I don't know what it is about that, Terry, but you always have to have an attorney.
Job security.
It is, I think it probably is. So that's your CRA. This is not easy to understand. I think we've got a good, diverse board that does a great job. I don't know that people are standing in line to do this, but I do feel like that we get good input. And at the end of the day, it's still your decision. We're just advising.
Do you know where TIF got started at?
Where it got started? You gonna tell me
No, I just
It's
want to
a
know if you
question?
know. Well, yeah, I just want to know if you knew.
where it got started?
California.
No, that makes sense. Well, they start all these good ideas, don't they?
Okay.
Your politics and mine are a lot alike, and so there's not any good ideas that ever come out of California. This might be the only one. This is the first one, Donna.
I didn't know whether it was, yeah. I just won't say anything more about that, but yeah, I had read that, so. That could be a subject of fact checker.
Well, one of the things that you also need to keep in mind is that there are a lot of TIF in some form. Most every state has it. But I always get a kick out of different groups that go out and do these TIF studies and say, well, this is a net loser. And then they're referring to the state of Illinois, or they're referring to some other state that has a completely different set of rules than we have here in Nebraska. I'd like to think that if you go back and look at the projects that have been approved, I think the council's really split the baby right, okay? It's hard to prove a negative. We've been able to prove some negatives because we had some TIF projects that got approved that failed. So I'd like to think if they failed with TIF, that they probably wouldn't have failed, they probably would have failed without it, okay? I'm out here on a limb now, but I'm thinking that would be true. So if you remember the truck wash out there, flamed out. Another quick little story, since I'm trying to help Brandon win the money.
I lost already, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That truck wash was built, used TIF dollars. It failed. It sat empty for about a year or so. Bosselmans are in that building today. When the salesperson who had the building to go try to sell it talked to Bosselmans and said, come to North Platte, go into that building. Now, we've already kind of researched North Platte. We don't think this will work. We don't think it's economically feasible to come to North Platte. Okay, here's the deal. The owners of the building will let you use the building rent-free, basically a percentage of your gross sales. And all you have to do is take out the truck wash stuff and put in what you need. They'll enter into a longer-term lease with you, and you pay a percentage of your gross sales to do it. And you'll have the option to buy it at any time for X dollars. 6 months after they were here, they said, we need to buy it because we can't afford to pay the rent that gross sales percentage is, because our sales are way past what we ever thought it could be. Does anybody think Bosselman's would have come here if that building didn't exist? And I'm going to argue no. But they came here because that building was here. I'd also tell you, most of you remember who was the food service company? Hip Wholesale. Hip Wholesale was up on the north side. They wanted the city to step up and do a whole bunch of stuff for them, and the city said, go pound sand. And they went over to Gothenburg, and Gothenburg participated, tiffed them, and gave them some other incentives, and they built a brand new building over at Gothenburg. What ultimately happened to Hip Wholesale? Flamed out. It bit the dust. Who's in that building now, Rob? I'd also go back to the Budweiser building. The original owner who came to us for the TIF project isn't the owner today, isn't involved in management today. What happened? Sold the distributorship to the guy that owned the distributorship in Valentine. Merged the two together. I got an old crappy building in Valentine. I got a brand new building in North Platte. Guess what? Headquarters is now in North Platte. Now then later he sold it, but that building is still occupied today. Okay, so I'm just saying that not all these projects are gonna work, but once those properties go on the tax rolls, they're here. And there's a super priority lien for the taxing authorities. So that building sits empty for 2 or 3 years. The taxing authorities are still getting their tax dollars because it's a super priority lien ahead of them, and some lender who we should do a moment of silence for the lenders at this point, but there's some lender that's probably gonna make those payments to make sure that you get your tax dollars. So I'm just saying. All right, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it. Mr. Scaffield, Mr. Lucas, thank you for coming. Appreciate it very much. Okay, before Judy starts, we're going to take a 5 or 6 minute break. So we'll reconvene at about 25 till. Thank you. Everybody get up and walk around for a minute.
But yeah, and I think they are, because they. Good, thank you.
I mean, yeah, it's not for city employees.
Mine'll be about 20 minutes.
Just to show me, yeah.